The rain had been falling since before dawn. It came in without announcement, no thunder, no warning flash across the sky, just a slow, gray leaking that turned the lawns of Oakwood Cemetery into shallow mirrors and weighted the flower arrangements until the white lilies drooped like something grieving on their own. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the gathering in a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. It was black cashmere, double-breasted, with no embellishment. She had chosen it because it communicated nothing, no warmth, no softness, nothing that could be read or discussed or misinterpreted by the 43 people clustered around the grave of Lily Brennan, age 31, beloved daughter. Taken too soon, words on a program card that Emily had folded and unfolded 3 times in the last 10 minutes, without reading once. She was aware of the looks, not the grief looks, those she understood, those she could navigate. It was the other kind. The ones that traveled from face to face, like a low current. That's Emily Carter. Yes, that one. Thornfield Capital. The Forbes list. She had become, somewhere in the last 6 years, a kind of landmark. People oriented themselves around her, even at a funeral, even here, where the only person who had ever truly known her was inside a mahogany box being slowly lowered toward the mud. The minister's voice was a steady drone. Emily watched the rain collect on the shoulder of the woman standing to her left, Lily's mother, Patricia, who had aged a decade since the last time Emily had seen her, and who had greeted Emily at the cemetery gate with a hug that was brief and careful, as though she were handling something that might break or detonate. Lily would have found that funny. Emily pressed the thought down before it could open into anything. She looked instead at the other mourners, the arranged faces, the umbrellas, the men in dark wool who were almost certainly calculating whether Emily's presence here would end up in the financial press by morning. She recognized a hedge fund manager named Garrett. She recognized 2 board members from companies she owned parts of. She recognized almost no one who had actually loved Lily. That was the geometry of funerals. When you were rich, your presence colonized the space. Your name sat over everything like a second ceremony. Even grief became a kind of performance, because whatever you did would be remembered and repeated. And the dead person at the center of it all slowly lost ground to the living person standing at its edge. Emily had been dreading this for 4 days. Since the call. Since the words accident and Tuesday morning and she didn't suffer had come through the phone and landed in her chest like stones dropped into still water. Lily had not called in 8 months. Emily had not called either. The distance between them had been accumulating slowly for years. One missed birthday here, one unanswered message there. The quiet geometry of 2 people whose lives had bent in opposite directions until the gap between them was vast and full of things neither of them had said. Emily had told herself there was time, that she would fix it, that she and Lily were the kind of friends who could go years without contact and then pick back up exactly where they left off, because that was what real friendship meant. She had believed that completely, until 4 days ago, the minister said something about grace. Patricia Brennan pressed a tissue to her face. The coffin reached the bottom. Emily was looking at the wet grass when she became aware of someone moving through the gathering, not the shuffling, incremental movement of mourners adjusting for the rain, but purposeful forward movement, the kind that parted space around it. She looked up. He was coming in from the north side of the cemetery, along the gravel path that ran between rows of older headstones. A man mid-30s. She guessed in a dark jacket that was not a funeral jacket. It was the kind of jacket a person wore because they owned it, and it was dark enough, and they had not had time, or had not thought, to find something else. The jacket was dry, which meant he had only recently stepped out of a car. He was not wearing a tie. He needed a haircut. His shoes were clean but not polished. He was holding the hand of a child. A girl, 7 or 8 years old, maybe 9. She wore a navy dress that was a size too large, the collar slightly wide at the shoulders, and her dark hair was pulled back with the visible imprecision of a father who had done his best with a brush and an elastic band, called it good. She walked with her chin down, watching the gravel, one hand lost inside the man's larger one. Several of the mourners noticed. Emily watched their faces recalibrate the brief assessment. The conclusion: the returning of attention to the grave. A man in a double-breasted suit leaned toward his wife and said something. His wife's expression did not change. Near the perimeter, a cemetery attendant in a gray vest took a step in the man's direction. The man did not look at him. He kept walking, steady and unhurried, until he had reached the outer ring of the gathering and stopped. He stood there with the child. He did not attempt to move to the front. He looked at the grave. Emily watched him. "Who are you?" she thought. And then, quieter, underneath. "Why are you here? And why does it feel like you already know something I don't?" The minister finished. The gathered crowd began the slow dissolution of a graveside service. Umbrellas tilted. Murmured condolences moved from mouth to ear. Patricia Brennan accepted embraces with the mechanical grace of long practice. The man with the child did not move toward the grave. He waited, and then, as if he had been given some signal only he could receive, he walked forward through the thinning crowd toward the coffin. His name, Emily would learn later, was Daniel Whitmore, but she did not know that yet. She knew only that he was standing 3 feet from her best friend's grave with a little girl at his side, and that no one had spoken to him, and that the cemetery attendant had retreated after making eye contact with him and apparently deciding against whatever he had been considering. Emily watched him from 12 feet away. He was not handsome in the way that wealth manufactured handsomeness. No geometric haircut, no gym architecture in the shoulders, no studied casualness. He was the kind of person who looked as though they had been shaped by actual circumstances rather than chosen ones. There was something around his eyes, a held quality, like a person who had taught themselves to carry weight without showing it. The little girl pressed close against his side. She was looking at the coffin with the frank, unguarded focus of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she is not looking at something. "Sir." The man in the double-breasted suit had materialized at Daniel's left shoulder. His name was Robert Ashford, and he was Lily's cousin by marriage. And Emily recognized the particular tone he was using, polite on the surface, impermeable underneath. "I don't believe you were on the guest list for today." Daniel looked at him. His expression did not change. "I wasn't," he said. "Then perhaps I knew Lily." He said it simply, without apology or performance. "I'm not going to cause any trouble. I wanted to say goodbye." Robert Ashford's jaw tightened. He glanced toward Emily, a reflex, looking for the power center in any room, and then back at Daniel. "This is a private service." "I understand." "Then, Dad." The little girl tugged Daniel's hand once, twice, 3 times, her eyes still on the coffin. "Is that where she is?" Daniel looked down at her. Something moved across his face very fast, very private, and then was gone. "Yeah, sweetheart," he said quietly. "That's where she is." Emily had taken 3 steps forward before she was fully conscious of moving. "It's all right, Robert," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "He can stay." Robert turned to her with the expression of a man who found himself outranked in his own grievance. "Emily, he can stay." She said it again with no additional emphasis, which was the only kind of emphasis that ever worked. She looked at Daniel. He was looking back at her with an expression she could not categorize, not grateful, not cold. Something more like recognition. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and turned away before the conversation could become something else. The remaining mourners were drifting toward the black cars parked along the cemetery road. Patricia Brennan was being escorted by a woman Emily didn't know. Her head low, one hand pressed flat against her sternum, as though keeping something in place. The flowers around the grave were accumulating rain. Emily did not leave. She stood at the grave's edge and looked down at the dark wood of the coffin lid. She thought about calling Lily's phone, which she had done exactly once since the news, and then spent an hour sitting in her office bathroom, unable to explain to herself why she'd expected an answer. She heard Daniel Whitmore approach the grave and stop on the other side. For a moment, they stood there, a billionaire and a stranger and a little girl in the rain, with nothing between them but the width of a rectangular hole in the earth. Then Daniel looked up from the coffin, and across it, directly at Emily. "She didn't die in the accident," he said. She died protecting a secret she kept for you. The cemetery noise, the rain, the distant car doors, the soft sound of feet on gravel seemed to stop. Emily did not move. What did you say? His voice was level, not cruel, not performative. The kind of voice that has rehearsed a thing so many times that it has gone past anger into something cleaner. You heard me. Robert Ashford said something. She heard his voice, but not the words. She was aware of 2 or 3 people who had not yet reached their cars turning back, drawn by the gravity of whatever had just occurred in the air between the grave and the woman standing next to it. Emily Carter did not freeze, not in the executive sense, not in the way that would show, but somewhere inside the architecture of her composure, something went very still. She died protecting a secret she kept for you. She looked at Daniel Whitmore across the coffin. You need to explain that, she said. Not loud, not a demand, or rather, it was a demand, in the way that all of her statements were demands, so wrapped in authority that they no longer required elevation. I know. He crouched down and said something quiet to the little girl, his daughter. Clearly his daughter. They had the same careful stillness around the eyes, and the girl nodded and took 3 steps back and stood on her own, watching the grass. Daniel straightened and looked at Emily. Not here, he said. Not like this. He glanced at the remaining observers, Robert Ashford, 2 older women near the cemetery gate, a young man Emily did not recognize. But soon, she left something for both of us. Who are you? Daniel Whitmore. He paused. I knew Lily for about 2 years. We met through work. We were close. Another pause. Not romantically. She was my friend. One of the few real ones. Emily absorbed this. She had known Lily for 22 years. She had known nothing about Daniel Whitmore. That should not have been possible. They had not been in regular contact, yes. But she and Lily had spoken 4 times in the last year, real conversations. Not the performative check-ins that stood in for intimacy between busy people. Lily had talked about her job, her neighborhood in Portland, a dog she was considering adopting. She had talked about her mother's health. She had not mentioned a man named Daniel Whitmore who was, by his own account, one of her few real friends, which meant Lily had kept him separate. And the question was why? When did she tell you? Emily asked. Whatever it is you think you know. Gradually, he said. Over about 18 months. He looked at her with that same unclassifiable expression. She loved you. I want you to know that's not what this is. She wasn't angry. She was, he seemed to search for the word, tired. Of carrying it alone, Emily became aware that her hands, at her sides, were very cold. There's a lawyer involved. Daniel continued. Lily made arrangements. The will is being read Thursday. She asked me to be there. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain white, just a name and number handwritten in blue ink. He held it across the grave. Emily looked at it for a moment before she took it. His daughter had moved close again without either of them noticing. She was standing just behind Daniel's left elbow, looking up at Emily with the clear, uncomplicated appraisal of a child who has not yet learned to soften her gaze. Emily looked back at her. The girl said nothing. But her eyes asked the question that the adults were too careful to say out loud. Do you already know what you did? She was 8 years old when it happened. That was the relevant fact. 8 years old, which is old enough to understand that something is wrong, and not old enough to understand what that means. Emily Carter. Emily Bowen, then. Before her stepfather's name became available to her, and she took it the way you take a tool that makes certain things easier, grew up in Millhaven, New Hampshire, in a house that was technically standing but functionally collapsing. Her mother worked double shifts. Her stepfather worked sporadically and drank consistently. The neighborhood was the kind that people described as coming up, which meant it had not yet arrived, which meant that children grew up in the in-between. Lily Brennan lived 4 houses down. They had been friends since kindergarten with the organic certainty of children who find each other before the world has taught them to curate. Lily was the daughter of a plumber and a bookkeeper, which meant her household was functional and predictable in ways that Emily's was not, and Emily spent a significant portion of her childhood at Lily's kitchen table, eating food that was prepared at reasonable hours by a mother who asked about school. The Whitmore property was on the far side of the block. The Whitmores were not rich. Nobody on that street was rich, but they were several rungs above broke, which translated in that economy to a substantial social distance. The father, Gordon Whitmore, owned a small electrical contracting business. He was not cruel, not negligent, just absent in the way that men of a certain generation were absent, their bodies present and their attention elsewhere. Daniel was 12 when Emily and Lily were 8. He was mostly irrelevant to them, as 12-year-old boys are mostly irrelevant to 8-year-old girls. He had a bicycle. He sometimes rode it past the house. That was the extent of Emily's memory of him until the summer of that year. The summer that her mother and stepfather finally reached a specific kind of crisis. She did not remember all of it in sequence. Memory at 8 was less a film than a collection of stills, the broken lamp, her mother's voice going high and then very quiet, the smell of the hallway, the backyard fence with the loose board. What she remembered with complete clarity was running. Running to Lily's house, not calling, not knocking, just pushing through the side gate and into the Brennan backyard where Lily was sitting on the steps eating a popsicle. They ran together. Lily did not ask why, which was one of the qualities Emily loved most about her, to the vacant lot at the end of the block. The lot had a half-constructed building that had been abandoned mid-frame, open to the sky, with boards and construction material stacked along the unfinished walls. Emily did not fully understand, until she was much older, what had happened next. She had climbed the stacked lumber the way children climb things without strategy, with pure physical momentum, and a board had shifted. She had fallen, not far 8 feet, maybe 10, but onto hard ground, with her arm beneath her. And the sound her wrist made was a sound she did not forget. She lay in the dirt, her wrist at a wrong angle, and Lily was beside her immediately. And then, and this was the part she had half remembered and half constructed from later understanding, Daniel Whitmore was there. He had been in the lot. He had been doing something she no longer remembered: smoking. Probably the way 12-year-olds did things they weren't supposed to, in places they weren't supposed to be. He had been on the structure. The board that shifted had not shifted on its own. She had not known this at 8. She had not known it at 18. Or 25. Or 30. She had built an empire on the story that she had gotten back up. That she had been resilient. That the adversity of her childhood had forged something in her. She had told this story in interviews, in speeches, in the opening pages of a profile in a business journal. She had told it to herself until it was smooth and solid and true. She had not known that 12-year-old Daniel Whitmore had carried the knowledge of his role in that accident for 23 years. She had not known that Lily had found out 3 years ago, found out how. She would learn on Thursday, and had made a decision about what to do with what she knew, but she was beginning to understand the shape of what was coming. She looked him up that night. She had resources that made looking people up a different order of endeavor than it was for most, not just search engines, but proprietary databases. Research staff who answered their phones at 11 p.m., the particular machinery of wealth that turned privacy into a luxury only some people could afford. Daniel Whitmore, age 36, Portland, Oregon, B.S. in electrical engineering from University of Maine. A decade at a mid-sized firm, doing infrastructure consulting. Then, 7 years ago, his own company. Small, specialized, structural, electrical systems for industrial buildings. Not a startup in any glamorous sense. A business built the way businesses were built before Silicon Valley turned that word into something else. Slowly, with actual clients, doing actual work. The company was called Foundation Systems Group. It had 11 employees. It was, by every measure she applied to it, modestly successful, the kind of company that was growing at a reasonable pace, and would probably keep growing at a reasonable pace, built by someone who knew their field, and was not in a hurry to become something larger than what they were. He had a daughter named Hazel. Her mother, Daniel's wife, had died of ovarian cancer 2 years ago. Emily found this in a public obituary. Survived by her husband, Daniel, and daughter, Hazel, age 6. The obituary was for Margaret Whitmore, née Caldwell, of Portland, Oregon. It was 6 months after the obituary had been published that Daniel had apparently met Lily at some professional function. The details were unclear, and they had become friends. Emily sat with this. He was not, as she had half expected, a man building towards something. He was not accumulating. He was not performing anything. He was a man who had run a wire and bolt business for 7 years, raised his daughter alone for 2 of them, and found a friend in Lily Brennan who apparently knew things about his past that he had told her, in whatever degree of trust develops between 2 people who are both carrying weight they cannot put down. He had come to the funeral in the wrong jacket. He had brought his daughter because presumably there was no one else to leave her with, or because she had wanted to come. He had crossed the cemetery without invitation and stood at Lily's grave and said the true thing out loud, in front of witnesses, which was either brave or careless or both. Emily looked at the card he had given her. The handwriting was steady and unself-conscious. She called the number at 12:17 a.m. It rang 4 times. She expected voicemail. He picked up. "I know," he said, before she could speak. "I knew you'd call tonight. Tell me one thing," she said. "Just one. Not the whole thing, just one." A pause. "Then, she found out because she was with me when I told someone else. A therapist. She was driving me to an appointment because my car was in for repairs." Another pause. She didn't intend to find out. She waited in the car. The window was down. "My therapist's office is on the ground floor." Emily thought about this. Lily in a parked car. A ground floor window. A man on a couch, talking to someone about a thing that had been eating at him for 20 years. "She never told me," Emily said. "I know," he said. "She argued with herself about it for a long time. She told me she had almost called you probably 6 or 7 times. He stopped. "Then, she called me the night before she died. She said she'd decided to tell you. She said she'd made peace with it." The next morning, Lily had driven to a coffee meeting. A regular Thursday routine and a delivery truck running a red light had ended the decision she'd just made. Emily sat in the dark in her apartment and said nothing for a long time. "Thursday," she finally said. "I'll be there." She hung up. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her apartment, the city held its breath, or she was holding hers. She could not, in that moment, tell the difference. The law office of Patricia Henley, not Lily's attorney by long relationship, but by deliberate recent selection, which Emily noticed was on the 4th floor of a building on 5th Avenue, and was furnished in the understated way that law offices were furnished when they wanted to communicate that they were too serious for decoration. Emily arrived 3 minutes early and found Daniel Whitmore already in the waiting room. He was wearing a button-down shirt, properly tucked, and clean slacks. He had gotten a haircut, not a transformation, just a tidying, which suggested care without overreach. Hazel was not with him. Emily registered the absence. "She's at school," he said, as if she'd asked. "Normal for her? I try to keep things normal." He said it without self-congratulation. She liked Lily. She knows what happened. But school is school. Patricia Henley was a woman in her late 50s who had the manner of someone who had learned to be precise about difficult things. She led them into a conference room, offered water, and opened a folder. "Miss Brennan's estate is not large," she said. "Her assets, apartment, car, personal property, a modest savings account, are divided between her mother and a charitable fund for literacy programs in Oregon public schools." She looked up briefly. That was Lily. She was very specific. Emily nodded. "That was Lily. There are 2 separate items outside the primary will." Henley reached into the folder and produced a sealed manila envelope. "This is addressed to Mr. Whitmore. It contains a USB drive and a handwritten letter." She produced a second envelope, smaller, white. "This is addressed to Miss Carter. It is a handwritten letter only." She slid both envelopes across the table. They each took their own. "Do you need time?" Henley asked. "Yes," Emily said. The attorney left them alone. Daniel opened his envelope and removed a USB drive and several folded pages. He read in silence. Emily watched his face not intrusively, but because she could not help it. He read with the absolute stillness of someone who is bracing for something that arrives anyway. Twice, she saw his jaw tighten. Once, he closed his eyes and kept them closed for a moment. Then he folded the pages back along their creases and set them on the table. "Yours will say different things," he said, "but overlapping things." Emily turned her envelope over in her hands. Her name was written on the front in Lily's handwriting, the round, slightly leftward script she had recognized since second grade, when they had passed notes during a class about state capitals. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages. She read it twice. The second time more slowly than the first, going back to certain sentences the way you go back to a step on a staircase that feels wrong underfoot. "I have been deciding for 2 years whether to tell you this. Every time I picked up the phone, I talked myself out of it. And every time I put it down, I told myself I would call tomorrow. I don't know how to explain that kind of sustained cowardice, except to say that I loved you too much to risk what telling you might do to what we were to each other. That was my mistake. Not the secret itself, the protecting of it. The accident was real. Your pain was real, and what happened was real. Daniel was on that structure. He shifted a board. He didn't mean to. He was 12 years old and startled, and the board was already loose, but he carried that. And I knew, once I knew, that you deserved to be told. But here is what I also need you to know, and please read this part carefully. You were not cheated. What you built, you built. The accident did not make you. Your mother's chaos did not make you. Your own stubbornness and your particular kind of furious intelligence made you. I have known you since we were 5 years old, and I am telling you that is true. The lie is not that you are resilient. The lie is only that you were resilient alone. You had help getting back up. That's all. Everyone does. I'm sorry I waited. I'm sorry it took this. I love you more than I know how to say in a letter that I'm writing because I'm afraid I might not have enough time to say it in person. Lily." Emily set the letter down on the table. She was aware of the room, the temperature of it, the light from the window, flat and northern, the water glass she had not touched, the sound of the building doing what buildings do. She did not cry, not yet. There was something in her chest that needed more room than a lawyer's conference room would give it. "What's on the drive?" she asked. "Documentation," Daniel said. "Written account, dates, the therapy session, notes with my therapist's permission." She put it all together. He paused. I think she meant it as she wanted there to be something real, something that couldn't be disputed. "What were you going to do with it?" He looked at her. "I was going to give it to you." He said it simply. "If you asked." "And I thought you might." She had told the story so many times. "I grew up with nothing. I learned to climb." She had said it at MIT commencement. She had said it in the New York Times. She had said it to the interns at her company who came from places like Millhaven, New Hampshire, with their first good blazers and their specific hunger. And she had meant it as a gift. "Look, it's possible. I am evidence." And every time she said it, she had believed it. She understood now that the belief had been sincere and still only partial. She was not a fraud. She had worked. God, she had worked 20-hour days in the early years. The particular grinding physical work of building something from nothing, the years of sleep deprivation and doubt, and the specific loneliness of being smarter than most of the rooms she was in and not yet secure enough to bear it gracefully. That was real. None of that was invented. But the origin story, the fall, the arm that healed, the getting back up, had always omitted Daniel Whitmore. Had omitted 12-year-old hands on a loose board. Had omitted the cause. It did not undo what she had built. She could see that clearly, and she was grateful for the clarity, because there had been a version of this realization, one she had feared, arriving here in which she understood herself to be constructed on nothing. That was not the truth. The truth was more specific and more livable than that. She was constructed on something real, and the foundation of that real thing included an act of accidental harm that a boy had spent 23 years carrying and a woman had spent 2 years deciding what to do with. She was also aware of something else, something harder to name, which was the understanding that her story had meaning to other people, that she had deployed it, deliberately and often, as a kind of argument about the world. This is what is possible. She had used her own history as a tool. If that history was incomplete, not false, but incomplete, then the argument was incomplete too. She sat in the back of her car after the meeting and held this. Her driver, Marcus, was experienced enough to know when to say nothing. The city moved past the windows. Ordinary Thursday traffic. A woman pushing a stroller. A hot dog cart with a yellow umbrella. The granite face of a building that had been there since before her grandmother was born. "Marcus," she said. "Yes, Miss Carter. Take me back to the office." Of course, she had a board meeting at 3 o'clock. She would be there. But first, she needed to sit with the knowledge that the most important story she told about herself was waiting to be told differently. She called Daniel that evening from her office. He picked up on the second ring. "I've been thinking," she said. "I figured. The board. The accident." She stopped. Started again. "You were 12. Yes. And you've been carrying this." A pause. "Yes." She turned to face the window. The city at dusk was doing its particular thing. The lights coming up. The sky going from gray to a kind of bruised orange at the edges. "I don't blame you," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because I know that's probably something you've been. I don't blame you." She paused. "You were 12. It was an accident. The fact that you carried it this long, that you told someone about it, that you're here." She stopped. Let the sentence end there. Silence on the line. Then, "I've thought about telling you probably 100 times over the years. I didn't know how to find you, for a while. And then, when I could have." He stopped. "I told myself the distance was protection, that it would only hurt you." That was at least partly cowardice. Lily said the same thing about herself. "She was braver than either of us," he said. "In the end." A pause. Then, "Can I put you on hold for 1 second?" She heard movement, a door, a child's voice asking something. Then, "Hazel wants to know if you're going to come to Portland." Emily blinked. "What?" "She heard me say your name." "She knows who you are. Lily talked about you." A beat. "Kids are," she has a theory about things. About people who need to talk in person rather than on the phone. Emily thought about the little girl in the navy dress, standing in the rain at the edge of a cemetery service she had not been invited to, watching an adult grieve with everything she had not yet learned to hide. "I don't know," Emily said honestly. "That's all right." She heard him relay this to Hazel. She heard Hazel's response, which was short and apparently categorical. "She says that means yes," Daniel said. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, very small, very dry. The specific weariness of a parent who finds their child amusing against their will. "She's usually right about this kind of thing." Emily looked at the window, at the city, at her own faint reflection in the glass, the coat, the composed face, the woman she had spent 15 years constructing over the girl from Millhaven, New Hampshire, who had fallen on hard ground and gotten back up, and told that story so many times that she had forgotten it was not the whole story. "Tell her I'll think about it," she said. "She says that also means yes." There was, against every reasonable expectation, something that was almost a laugh at the back of Emily's throat. She held it there for a moment, surprised by it the way you're surprised by warmth when you've been cold for a long time. She did not let it out. But she held it. It took her 2 weeks. Not because she was avoiding it, or not only because of that, but because 2 weeks was the minimum time required to do what she had decided to do with appropriate care. She began with the company. A formal memo to her communications team, which she drafted herself and revised 4 times. "I am updating the personal narrative used in public statements, speeches, and media appearances to more accurately reflect the events of my childhood in Millhaven, New Hampshire." She wrote the full account. Not the clinical version, the true one, which included the construction site, the board, Daniel Whitmore's name, the boy who had carried guilt for 2 decades, and the woman who had carried an incomplete story. Her PR director, a woman named Caroline Banks, who had the professional instinct of someone who had survived worse, read the memo twice and said, "This will create a news cycle. I know. Some of it will be, I know." Emily looked at her across the desk. "Run it." Caroline ran it. The news cycle was what it was. Some of it was kind, the narrative of reckoning, of accountability, the billionaire who chose truth over polish. Some of it was less kind, the inevitable questions about what else might be incomplete, the social appetite for finding rot in any foundation that had looked clean. She read none of it herself, but she was briefed on it. And she acknowledged the briefings, and made no additional statements, and let the cycle run its course. She transferred 50% of the Foundation Systems Group's government contract pipeline to a civic infrastructure fund. She created specifically for that purpose, money she directed to rebuilding community services in neighborhoods like Millhaven, after-school programs, vocational training, the specific material support that filled the gap between children who had functional homes and children who did not. Daniel called when he heard about the fund. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. I wasn't asking for, I know, Daniel." She sat back in her chair. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. Not for you. Not because of the accident. Because I have been telling people for 15 years that where you come from doesn't determine where you end up. And I believe that. And I want it to be more true. The fund is part of making it more true." A pause. "That's a very precise way to think about charity. I'm a precisa person." Another pause, longer. "Yeah," he said. Lily said that. She was quiet for a moment. What else did she say? He considered this. She said you were the kind of person who needed to be trusted with a hard thing, or you'd never fully trust yourself. She said she was sorry she'd waited. Emily pressed her fingers to her eyes. She also said, he continued, that she thought the two of you that you would have figured it out together. Eventually. A pause. "I believe her." "So do I," Emily said, and found, to her moderate surprise, that she meant it. She flew to Portland on a Saturday in October, not for any formal purpose, not to close anything out, not to present a revised version of herself to a new context. She went because Hazel Whitmore had made a categorical statement through a phone held by her father, and because there was something in Emily that had been moving incrementally, with the slow commitment of water working through stone toward a life that included more things that mattered. Daniel met her at the airport. He was wearing the wrong jacket again, not the funeral one, a different wrong jacket. An old canvas thing that was clearly his preference, and he had Hazel beside him, in a red coat this time, in her hair in a better ponytail than the cemetery version. She was holding a piece of paper folded into a rectangle. "Hi," Hazel said. "Hi," Emily said. "This is for you." She held out the folded paper. Emily took it. She unfolded it. A drawing, done in colored pencil, of two figures standing in rain. One was tall, with dark coat and yellow hair. One was smaller, with a child beside her or him, it was hard to tell, which might have been intentional. They were both standing in front of something that might have been a grave or might have been a door. Above them, a yellow sun was making its way through clouds that had been colored gray but left gaps. "I kept it simple," Hazel said, "because I wasn't sure how you'd feel about a complicated drawing." Emily looked at her. At the absolute unguarded directness that children had before the world asked them to manage it. "I appreciate that," she said. "Dad said you were sad about Lily." "Yes, I'm sad too." Hazel considered this. "But Lily said that the best way to be sad about someone you love is to keep doing things they would have liked." She said moping was disrespectful to the person. Emily looked at Daniel over Hazel's head. He had the expression of a man who had surrendered a long time ago to the particular authority of his daughter's observations. "That sounds like Lily," Emily said. "Yeah." Hazel looked at the drawing in Emily's hands. "Are you going to keep it?" "Yes." "Okay." She reached over and took her father's hand, satisfied with the transaction. "Do you want to get coffee?" "Dad says you probably drink coffee." Emily looked at Daniel. "She's not wrong," she said. "She usually isn't," he said. "It's very inconvenient." They walked out of the arrivals hall, a woman in a cashmere coat, and a man in the wrong jacket and a 9-year-old who had decided, with the clean certainty of a child who has not yet learned to hedge her conclusions, that this was the right thing to do and that the three of them would figure out the rest later. Outside, Portland's sky was doing its particular gray and silver thing. Clouds moving fast and low with the promise of rain. But not yet, not yet, and in that space, in the pause between what had ended and what had not begun, in the ordinary late-morning light of an airport drop-off zone, Emily Carter folded a child's colored pencil, drawing carefully along its creases, and put it in the pocket of her coat, close to where she kept things she meant to keep. The truth had a cost. It always did. But so did the version of herself she had been carrying for 15 years, the woman who stood alone at the start of her own story, with no one helping her up, no board, no 12-year-old boy, no best friend, 4 houses down, who had known her since before she knew herself. That woman had been real in her own way. But she had been a fraction. The fuller version was harder to carry. It had more weight because it had more people in it, the weight of what Daniel had lived with. The weight of what Lily had protected and then let go of. The weight of the girl in Millhaven who had fallen in the dirt and been helped to her feet by hands she had never properly acknowledged. She could carry it. She had, as it turned out, always been stronger than the story she told about her strength. The three of them turned away from the terminal and walked toward the parking structure, and the clouds moved overhead, and the city waited to do what cities do: continue, persist, hold all the complicated ordinary weight of people trying to be honest with each other. And after a while, very quietly, it began to rain.